Hello everybody, I'm KC and welcome to our edition of Let's Talk About. Today, let's talk about how surreal it is that I've been doing this reviewing thing for 5 years now. 5 years of this dorky hobby talking about my various nerdy obsessions in elaborate detail. So for my 5-year anniversary, let's just keep doing that. But we can't just talk about one thing I love for the 5-year anniversary. We gotta go over several. Back for my second anniversary, I did a list of my top 20 favorite TV shows, and after I did that, one of the most common questions I got was people wondering when I was going to do a list of my favorite movies. I had every intention to do that for another anniversary, I just wasn't sure when. Well look, I finally got around to it. That's right, I finished things. Part 3 of the Shadow the Hedgehog series will come someday, I swear. Naturally, being an introverted homeschooled nerd with a mother who was also very into movies, I have seen a lot of them, so narrowing this down to even my special extended 20 was insanely difficult, but I think in the end I came up with a good, eclectic group to compose my top 20 favorite movies. Not the greatest movies ever, of course, but that's why I continue to emphasize that these are favorites lists, not best lists. These are just the movies that I have watched several times, made me appreciate a part of the filmmaking process, or just mean something to me on a deeper level. So let's just cut to the chase and start this long-awaited countdown with
moving pictures, millions of pixels.
number 20. An Adventure in Space and Time. This might be a weird one to start off with since it's technically a TV movie and not a big feature film, but this movie is so wonderful and in my opinion underrated that I couldn't pass up the urge to highlight it. An Adventure in Space and Time is the story of developing and originally producing Doctor Who, a retelling that is just as much a tribute to this long-running series on its 50th anniversary as The Day of the Doctor was. Between this and stuff like Saving Mr. Banks and The Disaster Artist, I'm finding these docudrama style stories about the making of pop culture pieces really engaging. All the trials and tribulations, all the piss and vinegar that goes into getting something like this off the ground, and then watching how the culture changes around them. It's kind of mesmerizing. I get the feeling that in 20 years' time, we'll have a movie a lot like this one about the making of Star Wars. It's a really interesting and revealing look at the humble beginnings of Doctor Who, how they had to fight for certain creative concepts that would become staples of British entertainment, and the exceptional group of people who fought tooth and nail to get it off the ground against their restrictions. It also shifts the main character about halfway through in such a seamless way. For the first half, it's focused on the creative team trying to get the show made, but it slowly but elegantly transitions into the story of William Hartnell's time on the show and how change and failing health started to take its toll on him, to the point that his forced departure in this film has become one of the most heartbreaking moment in Doctor Who's history to me.
I don't want to go.
Eat your heart out, Tennant. The production design and recreation of iconic scenes and monsters really makes you feel like you're watching these early years be produced and created right in front of your eyes, and the casting is exceptional across the board. The standout, of course, being David Bradley as William Hartnell, a choice that was so perfect that Bradley went on to play the first Doctor properly in Twice Upon a Time, and is currently producing a series of audio dramas as the character. I've never been crazy about other actors playing past Doctors, but Bradley fills those enormous shoes flawlessly. Whether they are historically accurate or not, I feel like you can tell when a story like this is told with reverence for the subject matter from the filmmakers, and very few radiate as much reverence as Mark Gatiss' work on An Adventure in Space and Time. It is a loving tribute to the series and the people who made it possible. If you're a longtime Whovian or only vaguely familiar with the program, I think An Adventure in Space and Time is a beautiful story about ingenuity and legacy, which even though it was never in theaters, earns it the first spot on this list.
That's the Doctor.
Doctor Who?
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number 19. Professor Layton and the Eternal Diva. Sorry boys, I may love your franchises more, but this is the ultimate, the greatest video game movie. Seriously, I have never seen the experience of a video game's narrative translated so expertly to the big screen. And this is coming from someone who wasn't that familiar with Professor Layton when I checked this out. The Eternal Diva does such a great job getting you invested in the world and characters of the Professor Layton series. The games already came with these charming animated cutscenes by a team who were more than ready to bring that animation style to a feature-length adventure, which really helps with the transition from the DS screen to the silver screen. Being a visual novel puzzle-solving mystery series, the premise of Professor Layton is easier to incorporate into a movie than some other games, where most of the fun in the experience comes from actually engaging with the action. Here they manage to integrate the mechanics of the game into the narrative in a way that becomes a challenge for the characters and delivers the same level of participation and engagement for the viewers. Though there are points where the plot can get a bit too dense for its own good or difficult to completely piece together on your first viewing, it's made up for by the general investment, memorable cast of characters, distinct and appealing art style, wonderful and endearing voice performances, at least in the English dub, though I'm sure the Japanese is great too, and the powerful and emotional story being told alongside the complex mystery. I did a full review of this movie a couple years ago where I go into more detail about all this if you're interested. It's one of those movies that will leave you with a heavy heart but a warm smile. It's got mystery, adventure, heart, one of the most underrated film scores I've ever heard, and two posh Brits sword fighting on top of a robot made of a cartoonishly elaborate organ. What more could you ask for? Making me fall in love with the Professor Layton series, where I felt many of these feelings over and over again.
I've got it, Luke.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number
on
18.
screens.
Singing in the Rain. Oh man, this one was at the center of my movie musical obsession, like it was in its golden age. Because of a musical we'll talk about much later in the list, I was more fascinated and hungry for movie musicals than ever before, and I scoured through my mom's DVD collection, which is massive by the way, where I found this. This is essential viewing if you are a fan of musicals. This was towards the end of the era where Hollywood was churning out about 1 billion movie musicals a year, and I can't quite tell you why this one stands out still to this day as the most beloved of its genre, but I think it comes down to just how loving and polished it is. It loves that it's a musical, it celebrates that it's a musical, but it's also down to earth enough to not get too swept up in the spectacle. There were only 2 overly bloated song and dance sequences, which was unheard of at the time, and one is so beautiful, varied, and stylish, it arguably influenced every movie musical after it to some degree. This was back when Hollywood was full of triple threat performers, and this movie has some of the best of their time, including the legendary Gene Kelly, working off each other not just in the exuberant musical numbers, but just in great back and forth conversation pieces with fun or loving dialogue. The story is a lot of fun, there's some great comedy that I think is sort of overlooked, but the thing that I think makes Singing in the Rain well remembered is that it's a fine-tuned movie in its own right, while being everything delightful about the classic Hollywood musical just as it was on its way out, and something I think we are just starting to slowly reclaim. I kind of have a hard time with musicals from the 30s and 40s that this one is paying homage to, because most of them seem to be all style and no substance. But Singing in the Rain has both in droves, and it's one of those movies that will make your day better whenever you decide to watch and sing along.
Just singing, singing in the rain.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number
on
17.
screens.
Mary Poppins. From one classic movie musical to another, Mary Poppins is a fascinating movie on several levels. I feel that most people, at least around my age, have the exact same relationship with it. They enjoy it for the fun and laughs and penguins as kids, forget about it for a while, and come back to it when they're older and realize just how much nuance there is deep inside this movie. It's one of the few movies that was a technical marvel in its time that still holds up today. This is all throughout the movie, but the most memorable is of course the live action and 2D animation sequence. This wasn't the first time something like this was done by any stretch, but it was certainly the most elaborate and felt the most lively. The music by the Sherman Brothers envelops everyone's childhood in one way or another, and is still some of the best in Disney's catalog, which is really, really saying something. It has an enormous cast of characters with ever-endearing and persistent personality and charm, all the way up to arguably the most challenging role in a Disney film, Mary Poppins herself. With a truly inspiring casting of Julie Andrews in her first film role, delivering such a lovely and practically perfect performance, it's one of those roles that will truly live forever. I cannot stress this enough. Hire theater actors for your movie musicals. They know what they're doing. All that makes Mary Poppins a memorable family film, but what makes it timeless in my eyes is the very subtle themes underneath the magic. I mean, it's very front and center, but just how powerful the story is doesn't really hit you until you grow up yourself. When the world gets more complicated and you forget the simpler joys, and maybe even what's really important. But Mary Poppins is a movie that once you grow up, it helps you recapture that joy, which is something deeply, deeply special and will make this movie stand the test of time. Though as very close to perfect as this movie is, I don't think it would have made it into my top 20 if it wasn't for how inexplicably I fell in love with Mary Poppins Returns, which is why it's sharing the spot on this list, because I will always sing this movie's praises. I will not be silenced. I did a very extensive review on this movie just a few months ago, so to keep it brief here, Mary Poppins Returns manages to do something a lot of these recent reimaginings just haven't in my eyes. Recapture the original Disney magic that its predecessor sparked, being delightful and loving to what came before, while stretching its legs to tell the story its own way. I think it was just one of those right place at the right time movies for me, and these two together are some of the most magical experiences you'll ever have, no matter your age.
I won't forget Mary Poppins. Promise.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number
on
16.
screens.
Biloxi Blues. So, a genre of film I tend to gravitate towards a lot are well-written character pieces, where the plot is substantial but light, and the best part is just watching the characters sit in a room and interact. And very few do this kind of story as well as Neil Simon. There are several exceptional movies penned by Neil Simon to choose from, like The Goodbye Girl, The Sunshine Boys, and the deeply underrated Seems Like Old Times, but in the end, I decided to go with Biloxi Blues. This is the second part of a trilogy of semi-autobiographical plays Simon wrote about his early years. Biloxi Blues takes place during his time in an army training camp in Mississippi during World War II. And I think one of the things I like about it so much is that it's not like other movies I've seen based around this era and this subject. I'm sort of fond of movies that take place during World War II, and usually they are very patriotic or very brutal, with the conflict of the war front and center. This one is more slice of life. A coming-of-age story, if anything, with the main character Eugene experiencing milestones in life while he's training to go fight in a war many people with planned futures just like him didn't come back from. There's a lot of interesting conversation pieces and scenes that really got me thinking when I saw this movie, with Eugene conflicting with the other characters in this movie with their own convictions and beliefs, and how that challenges what Eugene believes and assumes, and how these people don't necessarily change by having known each other, but are privy to new viewpoints by being stuck together. It's also one of the rare movies like this that never has the main group see a battlefield since the war ended before they could be shipped out. And I think it's a very interesting look at an unusual spot at this point in history by someone who lived through it. And of course, in true Neil Simon fashion, the dialogue is sensational. There's so many funny lines and exchanges that are just a joy to watch. Almost like you're sitting in that room with them wondering what you'd do with the last week of your life. There's something very real about it that stuck with me. And if you haven't checked it out and other movies written by Neil Simon, I cannot recommend them enough.
I became a writer. I wrote a few plays and just finished one called Biloxi Blues.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number
on
15.
screens.
So, with the dozens of adaptations out there, and with how much of a Sherlock Holmes fan I am, I knew I had to put a Sherlock Holmes movie on here. And I originally was going to show off and pick The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, because it's really good and different, and I don't think enough people talk about it, so please go check it out if you haven't. But if I'm being honest with myself, there's only one Sherlock Holmes movie that I could sit down and watch all the way through any day of the week, and I could probably recite to you from beginning to end. Sherlock Holmes, 2009. Alright, I might lose some Baker Street cred here, but just hear me out. On the surface, it might be easy to dismiss the 2009 Sherlock Holmes film as turning a famous public domain character into a hollow action hero, again, but beyond the surface, the great detective is actually well represented here. Robert Downey Jr. doesn't fit the usual features of the consulting detective, but his version of his genius and personality faults are just so damn charming, getting across all the best and worst traits of Holmes in a very satisfying package of a performance. And Jude Law as Watson is absolutely inspired casting. An argument could easily be made in my eyes that he's one of the most respectable film versions of the Good Doctor there is. It's one of the few movie adaptations where watching Holmes and Watson bounce off each other is just as engaging and fun as the casework itself, as it should be, amplified by the fact that this was one of the few adaptations to really go all in with testing their friendship, getting a near perfect blend of crime-solving partners and put-upon roommates. The mystery is solid and well constructed, the production work gets across the whole dirty 19th century look we were going for as the 2010s started, without being overbearing and ugly or desaturated to the point that it looked like the whole reel was dipped in coffee. The action can be over the top at times, especially considering the source material, but it's grounded and well choreographed and helps propel the story the movie wants to tell rather than swallow it up like other action movies. And the dialogue is not only fun and amusing, but also contains many quotes from the original stories, and not just the usual suspects that get dropped into adaptations.
Crime is common, logic is rare.
It's far from perfect, especially if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan. You will see some hiccups in translation, but I think there's a lot more there than most people give it credit for. I'm actually thinking of covering these movies when the long-awaited third installment hopefully comes out next year, because even with a different coat of paint, the picture this 2009 incarnation paints feels more familiar than most might expect.
Always nice to see you, Watson.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number 14.
Screens.
Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit. You know those series or franchises that you absolutely love, but for whatever reason you just don't talk about much? This is definitely one of mine. Being the filthy American that I am, I'd never heard of Wallace and Gromit before this movie began being promoted. But the charm of this quirky inventor and overly competent dog caught my interest almost immediately, and I was very eager to see this movie. Now the movie itself is great. It's funny, charming, kind of intense at times, and has a good family-friendly, spooky vibe to it. This is a must-watch for me in October. But it was a movie that, even though I liked it a lot, I kind of forgot about after I saw it in theaters until I rented the DVD on a whim about a year or so later. And what puts Curse of the Were-Rabbit on this list is what I discovered on that little disc. Looking at the behind-the-scenes for this movie was almost magical, is the best way I can put it. This was around the time I was really delving into behind-the-scenes features and how the things I love were made, but Curse of the Were-Rabbit was different. As someone who grew up at the dawn of CG animation, discovering stop-motion animation, that's something that looked as expressive and creative as any CGI movie of its time, was created with puppets and plasticine, was truly remarkable to discover. It's one of those moments every film lover has when they realize just how much work and talent goes into these things that you love, that while you watch them, feel as natural and seamless as anything you'd see in real life. I became so fascinated with stop motion and its techniques. For my 13-year-old self who just got her own video camera, it was literally movie magic, making my action figures move around in 5-second clips. And that wasn't all. There was also an extensive look back on the history of Wallace and Gromit and Aardman Animation themselves. Realizing that this movie I was growing to love more by the day was just a piece of a larger franchise was like finding a chest full of treasure. After that, I tracked down all the shorts released at the time. I grew to adore Wallace and Gromit as characters. I revisited the movie much more frequently, anxiously waited for news on A Matter of Life and Death, and watched this featurette so many times. Curse of the Were-Rabbit started a domino effect of inspiring dedication for me, and that feels really weird to say out loud, but I just admire everything about this movie so much. It's also an endearing and fun experience on its own that I could watch anytime. I may not have been inspired enough to create a pair of cultural icons in college, but it was one of those movies that made me appreciate the artistry and commitment and innovation that goes into making a movie.
Job well done, lad.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number
on
13.
screens.
Friend Roger Rabbit. I swear I did not intend for the Rabbit movies to be right beside each other. Okay, you know how I was saying that Mary Poppins was a technical marvel of its time that still holds up? This is also in that category. Once again, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was hardly the first movie to blend live actors with animated characters, but it may have perfected it just as doing this with traditionally animated characters was on its way out. It's also one of those movies that people see as kids that's probably a bit too mature for them. When you're a kid, sure, you'll marvel at the excitement of seeing some of your favorite animated characters in the real world and interacting across studios, but to me at least, I feel like I was just as entranced by the more mature and intense story. Somehow finding the perfect blend between zany cartoon antics and gritty down-to-earth film noir. This kind of blend of such cognitively dissonant genres could lead to parody to make them work well together. Curse of the Were-Rabbit did that to a degree. But while Who Framed Roger Rabbit has a fair amount of laughs, it is so damn sincere, having that fun while very much taking its story and character seriously. Looking back on it, this idea must have seemed insane, and I still cannot imagine how they managed to make it work to the point that it's a classic. The technology and animation work is absolutely stunning, making these two-dimensional characters really come to life. Bob Hopkins gives an incredible performance, especially given he spends 85% of this movie acting with floating inanimate objects. Christopher Lloyd's Judge Doom has taken permanent residence in every millennial's nightmares, and the story and mystery are surprisingly gripping. I think that's one of the things that stuck with people who grew up with this movie. It knew when to have fun with the stars of their film, but also not to tone down the stakes during the case just because kids were watching. It was a bit more daring and mature while being centered around wacky cartoon characters we've grown attached to and new characters we would quickly become attached to. It's one of the many movies on this list that I admired as a kid and respect highly as an adult. It's classic and innovative all at the same time. There was nothing like it before, and while a few people tried, there was never really anything like it again. And that's all, folks.
What's up, Doc?
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number 12.
On screens.
Forrest Gump. There's really no deep personal meaning to this one. It's just one of those classics I have a soft spot for. Though it might have helped that this one crossed my path during my history obsession. I don't want to say something like it's a charming little movie, but for what I really like about it, that's kind of the best way to describe it. Despite going through some of the biggest and most influential points in our country's history from the 60s to the 90s, it feels very intimate and down to earth with Forrest as our simple protagonist. Tom Hanks walks the fine line of portraying Forrest's handicaps while displaying his strengths, presenting how a person like this can still have value and make major contributions even if the world around him doesn't see how.
So I went again, and I met the President of the United States again.
It's one of my favorite performances in his very expanded career, and managed to not become offensive with age, which is a miracle for this type of character in a film. And how Forrest's innocent nature touches all the people around him, and at some bizarre points influences history, is really touching to me. That and the visual effects work to put Forrest in some of these old newsreels is quite a feat for 1994. You sympathize with every character's journey, even when they make questionable and harmful choices. It may be granted its span of time and in historical events, but it's very personal and touching in its character actions and emotional moments. I dare say that it's inspiring. It's one of those movies that does a little bit of everything. It makes you laugh, it makes you gasp, it makes you cry, and it makes you cheer. I have watched this movie so many times and still feel all of these things as I watch it. Now I know this entry is a bit shorter than the others, but really, that's all I have to say about that.
That's all I have to say about that.
Moving pictures, millions of pixels.
Number 11. The Lego Movie. I remember seeing the Lego Movie promoted and thinking it was the dumbest idea ever, as I'm sure some of you did. But my curiosity was spiked when it came out in theaters and the overwhelmingly positive reviews started pouring in, so by the time it came out on home media, I was ready to burn it down. Which is odd for me, but I was just that convinced that this idea couldn't work. I sat there, more skeptical than I am with most movies, daring this movie to prove me wrong. I was ready to be that person who hated it because I just could not see how something creative could come out of this. And the Lego Movie proved me wrong in, I think, less than 5 minutes. There are few animated movies out there that are as creative and full of laughs and heart as this one. If you want a movie that perfectly fits the definition of creative, here you go. Taking the imagination that comes with a kid getting a box full of Legos and running with it until it cannot breathe. With a colorful, eccentric cast of characters that lead to this being quite possibly the funniest movie I've seen in the last 10 years. Seriously, I was rolling at some points. One reason I'm glad I didn't see this movie in theaters is because I might have gotten kicked out with how hard I was laughing at one particular scene. Plus, it gave us the best film version of Batman to date. Yeah, I said it, and yes, this is a hill I am willing to die on.
Hey guys, I think we're about to crash into the sun.
Yeah, but it's gonna look really cool.
The animation is so creative in both the possibilities of Lego and their limitations. There are points where these almost feel like real Legos and this was stop motion animated. There is not a single bit of the environment here that is not a real Lego that you can buy. I always admire that kind of attention to detail. It's amazing to me when artists think of stuff like that. All that would be enough to make this a fun adventure and high above my mediocre expectations, but the Lego Movie actually has a lot of social commentary embedded in it. Yeah, I didn't expect that either. It has a lot to say about what it means to be creative, societal expectations, the suppression of potential, and the possibilities of acceptance. That's just the briefest way I could go into it on a video like this. I'm sure there are very elaborate essays out there about this movie. And that is a sentence I never thought I would say about the Lego Movie before I saw it. The Lego Movie is so unbelievably creative in its humor, in its commentary, in its characters, and in its world building. A set of strengths that have persisted as it evolved into a franchise. It's way better than it had any right to be, and I am so glad that something like this exists out there in the world. I definitely wouldn't have believed you if you told me a few years ago that the Lego Movie would become one of my all-time favorite films, but I have never been more happy to be proven wrong.
And you still can change everything.
And now, to prevent this from being an hour-long video, I think this is a good place to take a break. Be sure to stick around for part 2 of my 5-year anniversary celebration, where we'll count down my top 10 favorite movies. Until then, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.